My name is Sunsara Taylor, and I write for Revolution newspaper. This weekend in the New York Times Magazine, the feature article is called The Women's Crusade. It's by Nicholas Kristof and Sheryl WuDunn. And it's a very moving article. It speaks very powerfully about the horrendous conditions that women face all over the planet, the mass rape, the brutality in their homes, the exploitation and impoverishment across the world that half of humanity faces. And it's very heartrending, the stories they tell. But there's a big problem with this article because it reaches inside you and it speaks in a way that will move you to feel for these women and want to act on behalf of these women. But what they advocate for are things that will actually further enslave women. And they do this in a way that's very dishonest. If there was some kind of an award for dishonesty and perversity, I would have to say that Sheryl WuDunn and Nicholas Kristof would win that award this weekend. The basic premise of their article is that things like NGOs and microfinance and microloans and other forms of imperialist development of the third world will benefit women. And they highlight, and of course, if you crop any camera lens close enough, you can find one or two women who have benefited from these kinds of programs. But the real story of imperialist globalization, including the NGOs, including the microloans, including the sweatshops, all of this has been to vastly immiserate and make conditions worse for women, as well as for people as a whole. So at some point I may have more to say about all of that, but that's just a basic fact. But what I want to talk about in particular today is what I find to be probably the most perverse, obscene, and grotesque part of their entire article, and I want to read part of it. They write, quote, "In East Asia, as we saw in our years of reporting there, women have already benefited from deep social changes." They go on, in the 90s, by our estimates, some 80% of the employees on the assembly lines in coastal China were female, and the proportion across the manufacturing belt of East Asia was at least 70%. The hours were long, and the conditions wretched, just as in the sweatshops of the Industrial Revolution in the West. But peasant women were making money, sending it back home and sometimes becoming the breadwinners in their families. They gained new skills that elevated their status. Westerners encounter sweatshops and see exploitation. And indeed, many of their plants are just as bad as critics say. But it's sometimes said in poor countries that the only thing worse than being exploited in a sweatshop is not being exploited in a sweatshop. Low-wage manufacturing jobs disproportionately benefited women in countries like China because these were jobs for which brute physical force was not necessary, and women's nimbleness gave them an advantage over men, which was not the case with agricultural labor or construction or other jobs typically available in poor countries. Strange as it may seem, they write, sweatshops in Asia had the effect of empowering women. 100 years ago, many women in China were still having their feet bound, while today, discrimination and inequality and harassment persist. The culture has been transformed. Again, there's so much wrong with this. It is true that 100 years ago in China, women's feet were bound. And it is not. That's over, not because of the sweatshops, not because of imperialist development, not because of global development. It's over because there was a little period in history that they somehow overlooked in telling this. It actually was a very big period in history. It involved over 1 billion people and more than 27 years of lived experience. It was the Communist Revolution in China led by Mao Zedong from 1949 to 1976. And it's true that 100 years ago, women's feet were bound. It's also true that a common saying in rural China was, "A woman married is like a pony bought. I'll ride her and whip her as I please." And it's true that that changed, but not because of the sweatshops. It changed because millions of people made communist revolution. In 1949, one of the first laws passed under the leadership of Mao Zedong was a divorce law, a new marriage law that gave women the right to divorce, the right to inherit property, to own land, to have custody of their children if they divorced. This was radical and revolutionary for any place in the world, including this country at that time. They brought women into education. They ended domestic abuse. They launched massive campaigns against domestic abuse that involved and empowered women. They ended prostitution. not by shaming women or stigmatizing them, but by giving them meaningful employment in all realms of society. Women were part of leading the Communist Party. They were part of militias defending the country. They were part of agriculture. They were part of building bridges and dams, doing work that women had been locked out of for centuries. All this happened not because of the sweatshops, but because of the communist revolution and the radical social transformations and economic transformations that went with it. And more than this, they brought about a radical and liberating culture. They made model operas and artwork that they brought to the countrysides and they put on the big stages where women were heroes and lead characters, fierce and revolutionary and fighting equal with men in every regard. The whole generation came up with role models like that. Compare that to this country with Britney Spears and women so thin they're starving themselves, and every young girl is learning how to act like a sex object long before she even knows what sex is. This was a radical and emancipatory culture for women and for people as a whole. Human history has never seen such a liberatory period as Maoist China. And that was ended in 1976. There was a capitalist coup. Capitalism was restored. Imperialist penetration began. This is where the sweatshops came from. They're part of reversing all that. They're part of ending all that. Today in China, there are 200 million internally displaced Chinese people, peasants, looking for work. There are 20 million people caught up in sex slavery in China. There are women, literally, in these sweatshops. This is not empowerment. They are literally chained to their machines and locked in at night. This is what they are lying about and covering over, and it's not that they don't know, because here's an interesting thing too. It's actually another completely outrageous thing. This article is drawn from a book they're about to release called Women Hold Up Half the Sky. And they say at the beginning of this article, this is a Chinese saying, women hold up half the sky. What they do not tell you, yes, it's a saying that came from China. Again, yes, there's a partial truth, but the real truth is that this was a saying that came from revolutionary China. It came from this period. It was popularized by Mao Zedong. This set terms for women everywhere, all over the world, and for revolutionaries all over the world. Mao Zedong celebrated that saying and made it popular among the whole Chinese people. Women hold up half the sky, and it is exactly that which has been buried and reversed with the restoration of capitalism, the very thing that Kristof and WuDunn are celebrating. And what's perhaps even more outrageous and more of an indictment, not just of Kristof and WuDunn, but of their publisher, of the NYTimes, and of the whole state of so-called intellectual discourse in this country, is the fact that they think they can publish this blatant and bald-faced lie about women holding up half the sky being part of imperialism as opposed to part of the need to have revolution to get rid of imperialism, and part of the actual history of communist revolutions and the need for more of them in the world today. The fact that they think they can get away with this and no one's going to call them on this has everything to do with how much this history has been buried. And this is what people need to know about. There's so much more in this. The main thing is you've been lied to. It matters tremendously that you find out the truth if you really care about women's empowerment, if you really care about the liberation of women, if you really care about the emancipation of humanity as a whole. I invite you and I challenge you to go to Revolution Newspaper's website, revcom.us, revcom.us, and look up the Declaration for the Liberation of Women and the Emancipation of all humanity. It goes into this actual history. It goes into the revolution that we can make as it's been re-envisioned by Baba Bakian. And it's imperative that anybody who genuinely cares about this finds out the truth and engages this work. Thank you.